The search for a Canadian identity, as writer Margaret Atwood once put it, is like a dog chasing its own tail. Defining the Canadian mind may be a similar effort in futility, but my next guest may well have done just that with his latest collection. Here to talk about the Canadian mind, essays on writers and thinkers, is philosopher, journalist, and author Andy Lamey. So welcome, Andy. Yes, the Canadian Mind looks at the likes of Margaret Atwood, Conrad Black, and David Frum, just to name a few. What inspired you to put this collection together?
I've been writing about Canadian writers for a long time now, and I wanted to bring together a lot of essays and articles that examine them collectively to see what we might learn by juxtaposing those kinds of discussions. And I also was interested in the question you quoted from Margaret Atwood about the quest for the Canadian identity. And I wanted to sort of reframe that question and try to answer it in a new way.
I think the way you put it was, can we learn anything by examining a group of writers and thinkers who have nothing in common save for a connection to Canada? And I'll ask you, can we?
Um, the short answer is yes, but I think it's a way that has sort of often been sort of overlooked. So it was once common to try to find the quest for the Canadian identity, to look to things like novels and poems and short stories and hope to find some pattern that is distinctive of Canadian fictional creative writing. And that project, I think, doesn't have many advocates today. But what I argue in the book, sort of implicitly in what I'm saying, is there's something very distinctly Canadian about that search, that kind of desire for something that is distinctive. And what I say in the book ultimately is that Canada has been like a laboratory for political ideas that have been formulated by Canadian political philosophers. And they have done something like captured, one of the lines I use is sort of capturing Canadian political experience in thought and articulating a way for diverse nations to live together under one state. So French, English, Indigenous. And that has, I think, been Canada's real kind of intellectual legacy at the level of Canadian letters. There's been enormous interest and there in those ideas, and there's something very distinctively Canadian about that.
One of the points you make is how arguably our Constitution, the 1982 Constitution, is more influential than the much more celebrated American one.
Yeah, so if you think about sort of the questions that we've had to kind of grapple with, the endless debates about, distinct society and what's Quebec's place in Canada, those debates in many ways are much more similar to debates in other countries that also are defined by different national groups trying to live together. You see that, there's just so many countries where you have something like that arrangement. And Canada has, tried to figure out a way for groups to live together in a way that respects the rights of individuals, but also allows some expression of collective cultural identity. And that's just much more common than, there's a greater affinity between Canada and European countries, Australia, lots of places in Asia, compared to the American way of doing things. And yeah, the Canadian Supreme Court in particular has been had a much higher sort of uptake in terms of its decisions internationally than the US today.
One of the more illuminating concepts, to me at least, that you explore early on is this idea of literary nationalism, which you point out usually takes root in societies that are anxious about the influence of a foreign power, in our case, the US. But as you go on to say, it's the sort of thing that a country can grow out of. Have we grown out of it?
I think we have in a lot of ways. There was a certain kind of intensity to Canadian cultural nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s. And so I think people you see that anxiety in, for example, the reluctance to criticize Canadian books and authors. And so I think we well and truly have grown out of that and some of the other sort of tics and limitations of that view. But in part, I think we've been able to outgrow the insecure insecure phase of Canadian nationalism, in part because although I'm quite critical of the Atwood generation, I do praise them in some ways because in many ways they succeeded at their goals. When they were coming to consciousness in Canada in the 50s and early 1960s, you didn't have literary presses that specialized in Canadian books. You didn't have theaters that put on Canadian plays. You didn't have Canadian studies programs. Those are all kind of a natural feature of the cultural landscape that we take for granted today. So we've in part been able to, I think, outgrow that sort of anxious period, in part because Canadian culture, it's not perfect, but it has a much more secure foothold than it did back then.
And it was thanks to Atwood and people of that generation who basically defined the culture that we have today.
Yeah, they put in place a lot of the institutions that are still there. Some of their ideas, as I say at length in the book, some of their critical ideas, I don't think those are still with us. So I don't think there's many people today who want to pick up Canadian novels and look for particular patterns of survival and things of that nature. So it's a mixed legacy. There's a certain irony, I think, in their legacy. And one of the things they wanted to do was they wanted to go back and look throughout Canadian history and say, oh, there's been a lot of great writing in Canada as far back as the 19th century. That part of their legacy, I don't think has stood the test of time. There's a lot of very avid readers in Canada today, but few of them, I think of Canadian literature as a 19th century literature. We're much more interested in literature of today. So the irony is, it was her generation, although they wanted to point back to the past as this resource for Canadian writing. Really, what was really going on was they themselves were the first generation to put in place not only institutions, but great works of art and novels by Atwood and others.
The line that I like of yours, I like many lines of yours in the book, but this one speaks particularly resonantly, is that English Canada went through its own quiet revolution in the late 1960s and 1970s as the boomer generation affirmed the value of Canadian art and culture. And for good or ill, we're living with that today.
We are. There's a famous line by a prominent Canadian journalist, Robert Fulford, about what it was like to grow up in Canada in the 1950s. And his line was, back then, if you were good at your job, especially as a journalist, the assumption was you would eventually, quote, graduate from Canada. You would move on to the US. And so the fact that that is not the automatic assumption, the idea of Canada as a place to escape, the fact that that's no longer the widespread view, that 60s and 70s generation, they have something to do with that, and they deserve credit. They deserve credit for that. Even if, as I try to say in the book, some of their other ideas, are not worth hanging on to.
Just as an aside, you reminded me of the debates that happened around the time of the 1988 Free Trade Agreement, and that certain people fretting that with that change, with the stroke of the pen, many Canadian writers, performers, cultural folks would be forced to ply their trade south of the border, and that didn't exactly come to pass.
Yeah. I remember those debates quite well. Anyone who lived through them and who was politically conscious won't forget them. But yeah, so there was a lot of fear along those lines, and it seems like here we are. Canadian culture has not been destroyed. I don't want to say that everything is perfect. There's issues around the ownership of presses and stuff like that. But our proximity to the United States has that captures something deep about our situation. So on the one hand, there is this fear and anxiety that you remind us of being sort of absorbed into the American identity. But there's a good side to being next to the United States and being similar. And that is, if you compare, say, the situation of Canadian writers to that of writers whose first language is not English, our similarity to the US has, for many of our artists, been sort of our entree into the wider world. It allows us to have that much larger audience in a way that is not really true of, Romanian writers or Sri Lankan writers, what have you.
Another more contemporary topic you raise is that of cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, especially as it pertains to the novelist Joseph Boyden, who was effectively canceled once it came out that he was not, in fact, Indigenous. You make the case, I believe, that while what Boyden did cannot be defended, that doesn't mean his works should no longer be read. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So his misrepresentation of his identity was a huge mistake, and he can be and should be criticized for that. Um, if we want to create a fair society, we want to know who grew up as indigenous and who didn't, and sort of what how that's impacted their lives. And so his misrepresentation of his identity is is um, is indefensible. But his books have not changed, and there were many. I mean, it's the success of the Orenda, the book that I write about, was enormous. I quote critics who praise the book, including indigenous critics, and the words, the order of the words in the book has not been changed by the exposure of his identity. And so I do want to draw a distinction where I say, let's criticize him for his biographical misrepresentation, but we are still left with a good book. And the argument that there is something inherently wrong with in this case, a white writer writing about indigenous subjects, that idea should itself be up for critical discussion and debate. I think when you really look into it, it's actually a not very helpful view, and it overemphasizes, it directs our attention away from the works back towards the author in a way that I think ultimately devalues literature.
Is there a broader lesson here to what we now call cancel culture in terms of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as it were?
Yeah, some of the things that people said about Joseph Boyden online are, I mean, they were cruel. There was a hashtag cancel Boyden. So that way of phrasing it suggests there's something wrong about, the very being of Joseph Boyden himself. And he wrote a magazine article after all of that stuff happened, where he talked about, he's debating whether to kill himself or not. So what he did was a mistake, but he's also a very good novelist, and we should continue to read his work. And the way these issues are spelled out online, where cancel culture, to use your phrase, seems to be most prominent, there is often kind of a cruel edge that creeps into those discussions. And if we could avoid that, if this could be the springboard to reconsidering that, that would indeed be a welcome development.
And ultimately, Andy, what do you hope people get out of this book?
I mean, I wanted to write this book in part. I mean, there's a lot of criticism in this book, but it's not all critical. There's a lot of positive discussions as well. So if people could see, get some sense of the achievement of Canadian letters, by which I mean not just fiction, but also nonfiction as well, and get a sense of, how accomplished people like Will Kimlicka, John Metcalf, Mavis Gallant, Danny Lafayette, get some sense of their achievement, I would be very pleased.
I don't know if this was the intention, but I think one of the byproducts of this book is I want to read more books. I want to read Conrad Black's book that you talk about. I want to read Margaret Atwood's book about literary criticism. Is that a happy accident there?
No, I mean, that's, as a critic, I definitely want to sort of be an ambassador for many of the writers I write about. If you didn't start with Conrad Black and say started with Will Kimlicka, that'd be a little bit more, where I'm coming from. But yeah, the more the merrier.
All right. The Canadian Mind Essays on Writers and Thinkers is published by Sutherland House Books. My thanks to author Andy Lamey.
Thank you.